In a speech given to the graduating class at the Michigan Military Academy in June 1879, American general and Civil War hero William Tecumseh Sherman said, "Some of you young men think that war is all glamour and glory, but let me tell you, boys, it is all hell." No one who has been on the battlefield engaged in combat will argue with this. Hell took on a new meaning in the northeast corner of Poland early in the morning on the 6th of August 1915 in a place called Osowiec's Fortress. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Me, Myself, and I History, where weird history and strange happenings in the universe are always on the menu. My name is Seraphim. Before we begin, while I do not intend to get too graphic, there are some descriptions of the side effects of gas warfare on the soldiers in World War I. While there are no pictures, if you are a sensitive viewer, you may want to skip this video. Now, on to our story. As we talked about in the last episode, during World War I, Germany was quick to unleash chemical weapons on their enemies. Men like chemist Fritz Haber were soon to drive German authorities to the use of weapons like chlorine gas and mustard gas as weapons of mass destruction prior to major offensives on both the Western and Eastern fronts. Once that genie was released from the bottle, only the completion of the war and the memories of the horrors it caused on both sides forced that genie back in. However, let's go back a full century and let's give some geopolitical explanations that will help us understand today's story. In 1815, after the War of the Fourth Coalition, Napoleon Bonaparte's forces lay in ruins. France would cede significant territorial gains made during their mad dash across Europe and into Russia. The German Empire would gain the western section of Poland, an area known as Prussia, and add to it that area that would be called East Prussia across the Baltic coast of modern-day Poland. Austria would be given the southern part of Poland, including the city of Krakow. Russia would gain the remainder of the east part of Poland bordering Lithuania, Belorussia, or modern-day Belarus, and modern-day Ukraine to the east and northeast. It came to be known as Congress Poland after the Congress of Vienna that created it, or sometimes as the Kingdom of Poland, because Tsar Alexander I gained the title of King of Poland in the exchange. Of course, not everyone was on board with Poland being partitioned. Several uprisings took place attempting to wrest control of Poland from Russia, but Russia's imperial hand was solidly on Congress Poland. Poland was a valuable territory for the Russian Empire with fertile croplands as well as some mineral wealth and at least some access to nearby ports in East Prussia. The real problem was that the German Empire made claims on much of the same region, including the Baltic lands under Russian control since the time of the Teutonic Knights and the Hanseatic League starting in the Middle Ages. With control of these territories, the German Empire might be able to completely dominate territorial trade in Northern Europe and keep the rival Russian Empire under its economic thumb, as well as deny it the Baltic ports they sought to control. Still, things were on a fairly level playing field between the two empires for nearly a century. Krepost Osowiec, or Osowiec's Fortress, was created by the Russian Empire under Tsar Alexander III between 1882 and 1892 as a defensive fortification. It was to stand guard over one of the few transportation and communications corridors through an area covered largely in swamps and bogs. Located on the Biberza River, a mere 50 kilometers from the border with East Prussia, it guarded the access to the strategically important Bialystok-Luk-Königsberg rail line, which ran literally right through the fortress. By 1914, the Balkan region had witnessed more than a century of intermittent conflict as nation after nation sought and gained its independence from the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire, arguably at its political and imperial pinnacle, counted itself as the protector of all Slavic peoples, especially the Eastern Orthodox ones. Some of these nations had simply traded hands and had gone from the possession of the Ottomans to the Austrian Empire. The Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary, or Austro-Hungarian Empire as it is known widely today, was in a bit of a crisis at this point. At once it had both imperialist aims leading to the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and a succession problem. The succession problem lay in the fact that the Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, Franz Joseph, had no direct heir. His heir apparent was his nephew, Franz Ferdinand. The Black Hand, a pro-Slavic underground organization dedicated to the creation of a Greater Serbia, which included parts of Bosnia, determined to assassinate Franz Ferdinand. Gavrilo Princip rose to the challenge. Ferdinand and his wife, who were in Sarajevo for the official opening of a state museum, died at Princip's hand that day in 1914. For a month, there was a confused and rapid trading of demands and threats back and forth across Europe. The end result, as we all know, was that the Germans, Austrians, and their allies, the Central Powers, were at war with the British, French, Italians, and Russians, the Allied powers. What was supposed to be yet another of history's 90 days and home kind of war quickly broke down into a stalemate with entrenchments, mud, and artillery barrages, and death to a degree never before seen in warfare, as each side tried to break the stalemate by any means at their disposal. This is where Fritz Haber comes back to haunt us. As we mentioned in the last video, Haber was a Jewish man from a provincial town in Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany. He went on to become a professor of chemistry and electrochemistry at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. When the war broke out, he immediately offered his services to the War Ministry. He was given a junior officer's rank and went to work on Germany's problem of being cut off from all of her overseas supplies of important things like nitrates, which are important for other things like gunpowder and fertilizer. Haber was an accomplished chemist, and he knew well and good that by reversing the process that provided ammonium nitrate fertilizer, he could provide all of the nitrates needed for things like bullets and artillery shells. Unfortunately for Germany, these weren't breaking the stalemate. He urged the German High Command to take up chemical weapons. At first they balked at this as barbaric, but he persisted. He knew that by adding chlorine to his ammonia formula, you could create an asphyxiating gas. That incidentally turned into hydrochloric acid when it met the water vapor in the lungs of the victim's airways. In September 1915, he tested it on the Western Front near Ypres, Belgium. A 15-foot or 4.5-meter high wall of greenish-yellow gas moved across the field, releasing 168 tons of the toxic fumes. After the test, euphemistically called Operation Disinfectant, 6,000 Allied troops lay dead and thousands more injured beyond medicine's ability to cure. Soon the gas was put into artillery shells. Haber returned to his home in Berlin, where a party in his honor was held, much against his pacifist wife's protests. Haber was a German super-patriot, and his services belonged to his country, he replied to her. That night, she used his service pistol to commit suicide in their garden in protest of her husband's perversion of science. Haber simply left his 13-year-old son to deal with her death the next morning and departed for the Eastern Front to instruct the German troops there how to correctly handle and use the new fearsome weapon. It was a choice he regretted later in life. And this brings us back to Osowiec's fortress. The German High Command had determined to take the war to the enemy and to drive into the Russian Empire's lands in what is now Poland and Ukraine. They would capture not only fertile croplands, but mineral resources as well if they could take these lands. If they could grind down Tsar Nikolai's forces, they could force a separate peace and then focus all of their resources on the Western Front to boot. One of the things they needed was the Bialystok-Königsberg rail line, which, as we mentioned above, ran through Osowiec's fortress. This had to be taken so that the strategically valuable rail line could be used to move men and equipment past the swamp lands rapidly to the east. To this intent, the 76th Landwehr Division, with either 11 or 12 battalions ready to attack and 6 in reserve, were positioned nearby. The Germans also knew that the Russians lacked gas masks. Approximately 2 weeks earlier, scores of bottles of chlorine gas, this time with bromine added to intensify the effect, were stealthily brought in. It was a matter of awaiting the correct weather conditions to use the horrible weapons, after which one might expect to simply walk in and occupy the fortress, gaining control of the eagerly desired rail line. Defending the fortress and the surrounding areas were a mere 500 Russian regulars supported by several hundred Polish militia under the command of General Lieutenant Brzezinski. Many of them had just come back from an overnight patrol and were trying to get a bit of shut-eye. Others were isolated scout units in the field, and secret sentries set out to give an alert if they encountered Germans probing the lines. What all of them had in common was that they were badly outnumbered and completely unequipped for what was to come. About 6 weeks before the test of chlorine gas at Ypres, on the 6th of August at 0400 hours, the weather conditions were perfect to release the gas. A cloud described as dark green spread across the face of the land and spread up to a size of 6 by 20 kilometers, killing plant, animal, and man alike. Then, when it was determined it was safe to do so, the Germans put on their gas masks and began moving forward with a combined 7,000 men as siege artillery began to pound the fortress and other positions in advance of the army. While nearly all of the men on the Russian side died almost immediately, some survived for a time and began to fight back as best they could. They would soak rags or urinate on shirts and wrap them around their faces to try and stave off the effects of the gas. It did little, if any good, for their distressed airways and unprotected eyes as the chlorine turned to hydrochloric acid in their lungs and on the surface of their eyes. The bromine that was added to the mixture burned their exposed skin away. Quickly, men were coughing up blood and even chunks of their own lungs. The Germans cut several openings in the Russians' now unmanned defenses and began working toward the fortress. Suddenly, the Russians' artillery inside the fortress, along with machine gun placements, began to open up, tearing holes in the Germans' advance. This is where it gets a little weird. A short time later, the Russian reinforcements had come up from the rear. Seeing these reinforcements coming up fast with bayonets fixed, about 100 Russian troops who had survived the gas attack and the artillery bombardment that followed rose up rather like zombies. With bloodied rags on some faces and others with bare faces covered in blood and the gore of their own lungs, they fixed bayonets and began to lead the counterattack. Staring back at the Germans through eyes filled with bloodied tears, their sight must have been a horrifying thing to behold. The Germans, appalled by what they saw, and then realizing that these Russians were apparently rising from the dead, not only stopped advancing, they began to retreat in terror. Soon, the willy-nilly retreat became a general scene of bedlam as soldiers trampled each other to get away, got caught on barbed wire, and ran without any real sense of direction from the Russian countercharge as the Russian artillery continued to pound them. By 1100 hours, there had been a full-on bayonet charge, and the Russians had completely regained their defensive positions. The Germans were driven back to their starting point. It was a brilliant tactical victory for the Russians, who drove back a force 7 or 8 times their initial size. However, what was left of General Lieutenant Brzezinski's forces were just too broken to hold on to the regained territory. The whole front had to pull back as a result, and a Soviet's fortress was eventually taken by the Germans. The Germans themselves abandoned it just 2 weeks later because it was simply too damaged to use. This horrifying event is known to us today as the Attack of the Dead Men. I want to give another shout out to the band Sabaton for their gracious permission to use a clip from the song Attack of the Dead Men in this video. As with the last video, I decided not to use the song for reasons related to possible demonetization. See the link in the description for their official video of the song and go show them some love if you like it. If you like this video, hit like, subscribe, and the notification bell. Then go share it with your friends who love weird history. Until next time, my friends, I am Seraphim with Me, Myself, and I History signing off.